Have you experienced any reality shifts in your life? Like maybe something really wacky happening in traffic with vehicles, or changes in scenery, or weird things happening with time? On Cynthia Sue Larson's website, realityshifters.com, there are pages, over 100 pages of submissions sent in by people like you with their stories of their reality shifts. And with Cynthia's blessing, just for the fun of it, I'm going to read you some of those. Okay, this one from Greg in Crawfordsville, Indiana. I was driving home along a highway, and suddenly an oncoming car crossed the center line and hit the car behind me. Parts were flying everywhere, and it looked like a lot of damage. I pulled over to call 911, but my phone didn't work. I got out of my car and saw that there were no parts laying in the road and no visible damage to either car. But the weirdest part is that they had switched positions. The car that had approached and swerved into our lane was now the car behind me, with the driver waiting for me to get back in my car so he could go. And the car that had originally been behind me drove away in the opposite lane. And when I got home, my phone was working. Here we have one from Anne in Copenhagen, Denmark. We were traveling with my husband driving along a dangerous country road in then Yugoslavia, along a 2-lane road with a cliff wall on one side and an abyss on the other. We had heard that at one time a truck driver had fallen into that abyss. There was no traffic in our lane, but in the opposite lane was a row of tailgating, speeding cars. As we approached a curve, we saw a huge truck coming right toward us in our lane, passing the tailgating speeders. And because of all the cars in his lane, there was no space for him to get back in there. It was heading right for us, and I knew we were going to die. Suddenly, a cloud of something engulfed us, and we couldn't see anything. We were still moving, so my husband pulled over and stopped to avoid falling into the abyss. Our car was covered with grayish substance, and when we rolled down the windows and saw the truck in its proper lane among the tailgating, speeding cars, how did this monster truck get in there without smashing 8 to 10 cars in the process? Wild. From Jim in Denver, North Carolina. Driving to work early one clear morning on a 2-lane asphalt dry road, suddenly my car spun 180 degrees around, and I was still in my lane but facing the opposite direction, nose to nose with the vehicle that had been behind me. But it was not the same vehicle that I had seen behind me in my rearview mirror just before it started spinning. It was a coworker in his car, and we were face to face in our cars, staring at each other, dumbfounded. When we got to work, I asked what happened. He said he didn't know, and we never talked about it again. Here we have June in Colorado. And it's cute that she put here, I'm a person who is not given into flights of fancy. So she's driving to work one morning. I stopped at the light at a highway intersection. A little further ahead are railroad tracks. As my light turned green and I proceeded towards the railroad tracks, the barriers and lights did not lower in front to indicate a train is coming. Time slowed down and something felt strange. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the train was there. As I slammed on my brakes, I looked right into the face of the passing engineer. He was passive, as though he did not see what happened. My car whirled around several times, and when it stopped, I was facing back the way I had come. The driver in the car waiting at the traffic light also had a passive expression, as though he had not seen what happened. I looked back toward the railway tracks, and there was no train rolling away. This one from Ellen in Limburg, the Netherlands. One day, as I was looking out the window, I suddenly saw through my inner eye that my son Jeffrey was going to get run over by a bus. Before I realized what was happening, in a flash of light, I swiftly shifted out of my body to the spot where Jeffrey was on his bike with an approaching bus. I threw my entire body weight against him, which threw him off his bike onto the footpath. I looked back to see his bike run over by the bus, smashed into crumpled scrap. I flashed back into my body at home, and later my foster son, who was with Jeffrey and saw what happened, said that a miracle had pulled Jeffrey off the road. This from Michael in Hartford, Connecticut. It was rush hour traffic, bumper to bumper in all four lanes of the solid wall of cars heading towards me. It was raining slightly, and as I shifted to make a lane change, I spun around 360 degrees and found myself safely on the left shoulder, just out of traffic's way. Somehow, a hole had opened up for me in four lanes of bumper to bumper traffic. Ooh. And this one from Joanne in South Windsor, Connecticut. I was pulling out at an intersection when suddenly another car came speeding down the road towards me and literally passed through my car and disappeared. It entered the driver's side door and exited the passenger side without impacting me or the car in any way. It was like watching a ghost pass through a wall. From Shuro in South Dakota. One day I was driving along a street that is normally very busy, but at this moment there were no other vehicles around. My car suddenly stopped and I couldn't get it to start. Just then, a man came out of nowhere, offered to help push the car to the side of the road. As soon as it was safely off the road, traffic appeared everywhere and the man disappeared before I could thank him. From Elizabeth in Johannesburg, South Africa. It was a very early one morning and I was on my way to work. There was no traffic, not a vehicle, and not a soul in sight. Suddenly, in the space of a few seconds, the whole road, as far as I could see, was filled with traffic. Excuse me. Okay, Deborah in San Francisco, California. A friend and I parked on the second floor of a busy parking garage. As always, we each made a mental note of where we parked. We returned about 4 hours later and began walking up to the level we parked in. We both commented on how weird it was that there were no cars anywhere and how everything seemed so quiet for a very busy downtown day. We arrived at the second floor and noticed there were no cars to be found, including ours. We figured we were in error and commented how odd it was for both of us to be wrong about where we parked. We proceeded up to the third floor and to our amazement, no cars. The fourth floor began to show some cars, but not ours. Finally, the fifth floor, much to our relief, was full of cars, including ours. As we proceeded the drive down to the exit, we were shocked to see that every floor level was full of cars. Karen in Clovis, California. One sunny mid-afternoon, I was driving along on the highway where I had driven countless times before. Shortly after I passed the spot where James Dean was killed, a peculiar sight caught my eye off to the right. It was somehow hidden, but was a sign, a peculiar sign. It was hidden, but had obviously been there a long time. Red letters in a semicircle on a white background. As I drove past the sign on the completely straight road, I suddenly found myself on a sharp curve and again approaching the same sign. As I drove past the sign the second time, it became the stack of an old ship, and I found myself on board looking up at that stack. The ship appeared to be about 100 years old, and the other passengers and I were dressed according to fashion of that time period. It felt like we were on board some kind of immigrant ship. The whole thing took place in an instant, after which I was back to driving on the straightaway. Terry from Noblesville, Indiana. My wife and I went to a small country market, and as we pulled up to the parking lot, we wondered if the market was even open because there were no cars in the lot. We got out and walked into the market, surprised to find customers inside. We turned around and glanced in the parking lot, which now had cars in it. Okay. Jen in Toronto says, I lived within walking distance of a supermarket that my friends and I quite liked, especially because it was open till 11 every night. One night I wanted to go there and my friends said it was too late because the store was closed. But it was only 10 o'clock, so I reminded them that the store closes at 11. They thought I was crazy because the store always closes at 10. So we walked there, each hoping to prove ourselves right. When we arrived, it was closed, and the little sticker timetable on the door said the store closes at 10 every night. The next day we went back and the usual sticker timetable was back, stating that it always closes at 11. And my friends were just as much a part of the reality shift. For them, on the previous night, it always closed at 10, and on the following night, it always closed at 11. From Gary in Farmington, New Mexico. As I drove to work, I could see these orange barrels. I would see these orange barrels for a major project lining the road. One morning, it looked like the project was done because in place of an old trading post with an old parking lot, there was a Burger King building with a logo on the side. And along the road, in place of a house, barn, trees, and a fence that I would pass, was an empty lot, although the hillside looked the same. At the end of the day, when I returned home from work, everything was back to the way it was before. From George in Manchester, UK. Our family was staying at a beach resort and one day I went into town to rent a vehicle. The office was very tatty. The desk was cluttered with paper, the whole place bordered on being seedy. The agreement was that I would leave the car at the hotel when done with it. I asked for a child seat and the man said he didn't really have one except an old one. It probably wouldn't fit the Jeep I was renting. I insisted and I was able to fit it into the back with no problem. It was tatty, but it would do the job. After I returned to the hotel, I realized I had left the rental contract behind, so I went back to the place to get it. The office was locked, but I could see through the window that it was pristine, with a neat row of many baby seats in great condition lining one wall. I returned a few times, but it was always locked, and I never did retrieve the contract and left the car at the hotel as agreed. From Dennis in Hawaii. I went to my brother's house to drop something off. He lives in a very long cul-de-sac with rows of houses on either side. I have been there many times. On this occasion, none of the houses were recognizable and I could not see his. I drove to the end of the long cul-de-sac, turned around and drove slowly past each house. I finally saw his, but it looked entirely different. There was grass growing on his driveway where should have been Futura stone. So I drove away, turned around and drove back. As I approached the street, the houses all began to look familiar and my sister-in-law was rolling the garbage barrel out onto the street. From Rihanna in Chicago, Illinois. I passed by an intersection I had been at 2 weeks ago where a new building was under construction. Curious about the progress, I was surprised to see that it was just an empty lot. The following month, I passed the intersection again and the new building was once again under construction and getting very tall. Evan from Cotati, California. I used to eat periodically at a taqueria called Roadrunner Burrito near the college I went to. The outside of the place had a Roadrunner painted on it and there was Roadrunner wallpaper inside. One day I walked in and the wall was covered with generic wallpaper. I asked the waitress what happened to the Roadrunner wallpaper and she looked at me funny, saying that wallpaper had not changed and the current one had been there a long time. And Kelly from White Wolf Retreat, Eastern Washington. My husband went down to the corral to feed our 2 horses and only saw one of them in there. He looked to the ground for just a second, and when he looked back, both horses were there. And from Wes in Fort Worth, Texas, I was in a grocery store pushing my cart through the produce aisle. Someone said hello to me, and as I turned my head to respond, my surroundings changed for about 30 seconds. There was no food in the produce section, the lights were out, and the building was in a dilapidated state. I could see the sun shining through the roof, and birds were flying around inside the roof, inside the building. After looking around, I heard a brisk sound, and my surroundings went back to the way they were before. From John in Manassas, Virginia. Is that what it is? Manassas? My wife and I went to an antique show, and as is our habit, we first walked the aisles, noting desirable discoveries before deciding on a purchase. At one booth, I saw an affordable etching of Niagara Falls. When we returned to the booth, it was gone, with an empty stall where I thought it was. We walked the whole center again looking for the booth and returned to the empty spot. I asked the nearby dealer if they had left, but he said there was never anyone there. Gary in Johnson City, Tennessee says, I returned to my hometown to see my mother, brother, and his wife and wandered alone one day to the old school I had attended in junior high. I sat on the steps thinking about the old days there, and I noticed vintage cars coming to pick up kids about the time the bell rang. I left the school and went home. Later, when I told my mother I had been sitting on the steps of the old junior high school, reminiscing about old times, she said, that's impossible. That school was torn down 2 years ago. Richard in the UK. I had only been in bed for no more than 5 minutes and had my eyes closed, but was wide awake. I felt a very strong physical sensation which shocked me, like almost being vacuum sucked out of myself and into somewhere else. I was transported instantaneously and was standing in a field brimming with flowers on a beautiful sunny day. I could sense and feel it all. Then just as suddenly, I was sucked back into being in bed. Margaret in Manchester, New Hampshire. I was driving my sister to and from work. The last leg of the journey was about a mile on a wide, well-developed road, which should have been a main route for many drivers, yet all the times we drove there, we were the only car on the road, with sometimes another car off in the distance. There were sidewalks on both sides of the street, but an almost complete lack of any pedestrians, except for this jogger that was always the same jogger in the same spot, making exaggerated running motions, but not actually moving. Sometimes we saw a group of 3 college-age girls at a different spot, and that they were always at the same spot, just standing there looking like they were posing for a winter fashion catalog. No matter how cold it was, even below 0, the cold did not seem to bother these pedestrians. Along the sides of the street were very nice houses, but it appeared no one actually lived in any of them. No signs of human presence, no cars in any of the driveways, no trash set out on the trash day, and none of the little things which say someone lives here, not even a for sale sign. The really weird part is the houses kept changing. Each time we drove by, those houses were fundamentally different from previous drives. I noticed it the second time we did the drive because I like to use urban landmarks like buildings to navigate. At first, I did not mention it to my sister, but then she commented on how the houses kept looking different and the general oddness of the street. The only constants about the houses were that they were all always older architecture, like Victorian or from the 1920s or 30s, but still kept in like new condition and very nice. They all had their windows blacked out even during the daytime. But other than that, the number of houses, their exact placement, their style, exterior finish was always randomly different with major structural changes, which would take a construction crew months or maybe years to complete. Some of these random changes involved the houses turning into fancy, ornate mini mansions. My sister is a skeptic, so it was reassuring to me, to my sanity, that she noticed these changes too. Dale Evans in Rochester, New York. I was reading a book, became a bit sleepy, and thought of taking a nap, but was a bit reluctant because I didn't want to sleep away the day and didn't want to wake up feeling groggy. I opted for the nap and lay down at 11:51. I didn't really fall asleep and was in that in-between state where I could hear my son playing video games in the background, and later I heard him let in the meter reader into the basement. I could hear them walking below me and then leave out the back door. Then I lay there a little while longer, and when I got up, it was 11:51. So that's the same time he lay down. With Akara in North Carolina. One night, I headed to the bathroom at 11:55 to prepare for bed. I like the 1155 that I noticed on the digital clock. I engaged in my usual nighttime routine: potty, brush, floss, remove makeup, wash and moisturize face, wipe the counter, etc. This usually takes 20 to 30 minutes. When I finished, it was still 11:55. Peggy in Sacramento, California. It was after 10 p.m. when I shut out the lights and started a Reiki session that lasted an hour. When I was done, I turned on the lights and it was 10 p.m. From Matt in Scotts Valley, California. When I was a law enforcement officer, a colleague told me about a shootout he had been in where everything slowed down except him, so he was able to keep moving fast out of the way of the bullets. I experienced something similar when I was a boy and stumbled upon a rattlesnake in a field. I ran for a split second and was instantly 50 feet away from the snake. My friend was shocked when he turned around to run and saw that I was already way across the field. Elizabeth in Victoria, BC. I was playing the flute for a symphony orchestra and had been granted a rather exposed and tricky flute solo to play. I practiced for weeks. During the concert, when it came time for me to play the solo, the conductor slowed down the tempo to about half the speed so that I was able to play in a relaxed and effortless way. As soon as the solo was over, the conductor brought the tempo back up to speed. After the piece was over, I turned to the second flute player and asked why the conductor had slowed down for my solo. She replied that he hadn't slowed it down and that I had played beautifully. Pam in Bloomington, Illinois. One night around the age of 8 to 10, I lay awake with a fear of monsters under the bed and the closet. I even turned myself around and lay with my head at the foot of the bed facing the window as if that would somehow fool the monsters. And I didn't want to fall asleep either in case I had a nightmare. So I said, if only I could just shut my eyes and count to 5 and then open them and it be morning. I shut my eyes tight, counted to 5, and when I opened them, the deep, dark, scary night had turned into a bright, sunny morning. Rachel in Wheatland, Iowa. My husband, kids, and I were going to the swim cove at Guffey and arrived in the parking area at Paradise Cove around 2:40 p.m. To get to the swim cove, you have to walk about half a mile down a rocky, precarious path, not an easy trek, to the small bay of water, a good 15 minutes hike one way. When we finally arrived, we explored the cove area by walking a trail downstream. Later, our kids ended the afternoon by doing some swimming. We had left our phones in the car, and on the hike back up from the cove, we guessed it would have to be around 4:30 or 5, considering how much time we had spent there. When we got back to the car, our phones and the car clock all indicated that only 1 hour had passed. Emmy in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. I taught a private lesson to a boy that normally lasts about 4 hours. We started at 10:15. And when we were done, I knew we had gone over time as the material we covered took at least 5 hours. Yet, it was only 12:30 when we finished. Alan in Glasgow, Scotland. I was taking the bus to a training course, and although I left the house in plenty of time, the bus did not arrive, and I ended up taking a later one, regretting that I would be late. As we sat in gridlocked city center, the thought entered my mind to slow down time. Without gridlock, the bus takes 20 minutes to travel this route. And it got there in under 10. Yes, I made it to the course on time. Terry in Provo, Utah. A friend and I were visiting another friend, and we were having such a good time, it passed very quickly. And suddenly my friend realized she was going to be late for a family reunion dinner. We were at least 45 minutes away from her parents' home and had 5 minutes to get there. We hastily said our goodbyes and hurried to her car. While driving down the interstate, we decided to try to slow down time without exceeding the speed limit. We arrived 2 minutes late. A 45-minute drive took us 7 minutes. I think that kind of thing has happened to a lot of people. Kay in Mount Shasta, California. A few years ago, I had a job where I had to drive to Ashland, Oregon twice a week. It was a long commute, and I started experimenting with time travel. I'd say a mantra and then imagine a time I wanted to arrive at. I created a wormhole in my mind and saw myself going through it. I wouldn't turn on the radio or watch the car clock as so not to disturb my intention. And I don't like speeding tickets, so I traveled within the limits. This was so much fun because it worked. Joseph in Shady Cove, Oregon. This happened in the Bermuda Triangle. I was sailing through the night on the Bold Venture. I think that's the name of his boat, ship, whatever the word is. But he was sailing through the night on the Bold Venture. At 2 a.m., lightning hit a wall of clouds. Cold air was moving down from the northwest, mixing with moist tropical air, and I knew a storm was on its way. I rushed down below to don my foul weather gear and made it back on deck to roll in the head sail just in time. The storm hit at express train speed, and we went up on our ear, heeling heavily to the side. Quickly, I turned sharply toward the wind and was relieved to find the Bold Venture right herself. One wrong move and the sea would have us. I kept my hand steady and fast on the wheel like an orchestra conductor. I was the calm inside the storm. By 7 a.m., the main force of the storm had moved east of us. We were still being battered by gale force gusts and mountainous waves. And I was surprised to discover the inexplicable fact that we had made it exactly where we would have been if there had been no storm. Colleen in Omaha, Nebraska. When I was 17, I was in a large city park with some friends. There were lots of people all around us. One moment it was late morning, and the next moment it was late evening. 10 hours of that day just vanished. And everyone seemed to accept that as if it was normal. Here's from Lori and Mac in Cape Cod, Florida. According to the city's website, since Monday was a holiday, everyone's trash day was bumped one day. So our Thursday pickup would be Friday. On Wednesday evening, we giggled because some of our neighbors were putting out their trash, forgetting about the bump to Friday. The next morning, as expected, there were no sounds of squeaky brakes and loud dumping of the garbage trucks. Later in the day, we were surprised to see that the trash of the neighbors who had left theirs out had been picked up, as apparent by the tipped over empty bins. We decided to put our trash out anyway, and in doing so, noticed the same neighbors whose trash was already picked up had put out theirs again. And it was all picked up again on Friday. And this last one I'm going to read for you today is from Mimi in Baltimore, Maryland. While visiting the island of Luga, west of Scotland, I wandered off from the group as they stayed behind to photograph the seabirds. It was a typical Scottish day, gray and rainy. Yet as I explored the island on my own, it became beautiful, sunny and warm. We'd been dropped off at about 1:45 and had been told to be back by 3:45. Suddenly I realized it was now 3:15. And I started to panic because it had taken me an hour and a half to get where I was, and there was no way I could get back in half an hour. I moved as fast as I could. And as I was doing so, I realized it was getting colder and darker and started drizzling. Eventually, I saw a woman from our group sitting on a rock, casually looking through the binoculars as if it wasn't even late. And it was still 3:15. Later, the boat captain asked me how I liked Lunga. I told him about how I enjoyed how sunny and beautiful it got as I wandered off, and about how time stopped when I realized I was late getting back. He said that it had been gray the whole time, and added nonchalantly that I'd obviously walked into fairy time. Aren't those stories cool? And actually, it seems like they're actually very natural, and these kinds of things happen to a lot of people. So if you have any stories, feel free to send them in to Cynthia. I'll put the link to her website below. And those were fun. If you want me to read some more, put that in the comments below, and maybe I'll do so. I haven't finished going through all of them myself, and there's so many, and they're really great and really fun. So till next time, happy reality shifting.